Okay. Today I was going to talk a little bit about pride and mostly some variations and examples. And I wanted to preface it with just why I think I personally find this so important to kind of try to find in my own mind. And years ago, I learned from reading Thich Nhat Hanh that actually you can't really love a person unless you respect them. And so if you have pride in your mind, you're actually having difficulty with respect. So in a way, to me, it's just been this kind of connection of this is getting in the way of something that I value. So to be able to, have positive regard for others and to care about their well-being and things like that, when we have pride in our mind, it seems to me like that's going to be kind of challenging to this lack of respect. And then pride is difficult to recognize. And so when I wanted to I didn't recognize it very well in my life until I moved here. And so I kind of continued in this theme of when I find interesting things about it, I like to read them and then try to just sit with them and identify them in my mind. So when we were doing the precious garden of the precious garland recently, one of the mental factors that we looked at was haughtiness. And I think that it was wise for Venerable to preface this section with, we have to study these and be honest and look inside. But she said also we have to have a good sense of humor about this. Because as we find these things in ourselves, if we can't learn to laugh at ourselves, it kind of gets a little hard to deal with sometimes. And I would say that sense of humor might take a while to develop for most of us. But there comes a point, for me, pride just feels like a burden. And when I can recognize it and dispel it, I find like I've lightened my load. That's my experience now, where that wasn't my experience at first. So we went into a specific one, this haughtiness. And we first learned about this when we were studying the mental factors a couple of years ago, and we took one of the definitions from Jeffrey Hopkins. So it seems kind of, in all of these, there's like this puffing up of the mind. But this is haughtiness is a particular kind of pride where we're in one manifestation, one definition here, we're kind of taking joy and comfort in observing our own good health, youth, our beauty, our power, our prosperity, things like that. And when I first learned about that, it reminded me so much of when I was in my 30s, and you're just love of life kind of energy but there's kind of like this, for me, maybe a lack of awareness of others in that sometimes, just like I'm having a good time here and I'm not noticing others or things like that. I don't know. I can see how that kind of energy, if not recognized, it's good to have good health. It's good to have these, things going for you in your life. But if these things aren't recognized and they're, and are actually arising as an affliction in our mind, which is what this is talking about, an afflicted mind where you're actually puffing things up, the value of your good health, the value of your beauty, the value of your prosperity, what you're doing with it in your mind, then that's a basis for afflictions to rise in the mind. It says, Jeffrey says that haughtiness has the function of serving as a basis for all afflictions and secondary afflictions. So we're just kind of opening the door to problems if we can't recognize this in our mind. And it actually, he says, acts as a root of non-conscientiousness. You're kind of not conscientious about what you're doing then. You're puffed up, there's no need to be, right? So non-conscientiousness, he says, is like a looseness of the mind. It's not keeping you from the afflictions and faults. And so you end up doing negative actions and things like that. So that's not where we want to go. So that's one way to look at haughtiness. But then when we were in Precious Garland, it was similar in that there was this inflated sense of self, this puffing up. And she described it as going on the side of arrogance. But then, in both in the Precious Garland and then in some other sources, sometimes this is taking a different, how would you say, a different category of your life that it's where it's showing up, is how I see it. In here, in Precious Garland, she said, this is making us unable to honor or respect those worthy of respect. So that was more the emphasis in Precious Garland. We get puffed up and we don't want to show respect for those who are worthy of respect. And she described it as like a self-infatuation where we actually couldn't see others' good qualities. So I think this is similar, but kind of a different context maybe, or maybe a different example of how it might happen for a spiritual practitioner. And then how are we ever going to learn if we're in that state of mind? How would we develop our good qualities? We actually aren't really in touch with the good qualities that are around us. We wouldn't model ourselves because we wouldn't we wouldn't be paying attention to the good models that are around us. And then I think this is a part that Venerable probably brought in here of kind of like maybe diving like what's underneath that. And I think this is where we've talked about other kinds of pride, but what she talked about is some kind of deep insecurity in ourselves that over some small quality that where we're like really inflating ourselves or really having a lack of self-confidence. You know how we've talked about inverted pride, where you're, instead of being the best of all, now you're the worst of all, still a kind of pride. So it kind of brings that in terms of helping us to recognize this so that then we can find what is the basis, what is the proper basis to build our self-confidence on. That's how I look at this. And then I just want to share another story. It's a different take, but I find these helpful because then when I know these things, I walk around in the day and sometimes I recognize something that I just did, and I'm like, do I really want that mind? Do I really want to act this way? And so this one was one that was, although it's more talking about like a yogi in a different time period, and maybe part of it doesn't apply, the examples actually apply to our life quite well. And this is Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche commenting on some root verses that are talking about some things that we want to regard with distaste, things that we want to abandon. And so the root verse is, unless you turn your back on your fatherland, you will not vanquish the demon of pride. So we're probably not going to run off like Milarepa and do that kind of thing. But we can look at what he wrote about this and see in our own lives how these come up. And he says, as long as we stay in our native country, there will be no end to disliking our enemies and being attached to our loved ones. That sounds kind of familiar even right now. In our own country, we meet people who are well disposed towards us and we become attached to them. This leads us to engage in all sorts of actions based on attachment. There are people who obstruct us and we think of them as enemies. And then he says it's impossible to avoid this attachment and hatred. So when we manage to get the better of our enemies, we feel very brave and successful. You ever had that experience where, that's kind of an internal experience? And in our dealings with those we like, we indulge in attachment and busy ourselves with all sorts of different activities. When we're able to help others and show affection for those to whom we are attached, we feel we are good people. That's very much my experience, That's basing my self-worth on my relationships with others rather than on an internal sense. And I don't think that's very stable. Not a very stable situation because our relationships with other people are changing like hourly sometimes. So what are you going to do? Just yo-yo up and down all day long? That's kind of what it does. So in either case, we are bravely subduing our enemies or virtuously helping others. We feel very proud of ourselves. So I think this is the part where I like the story aspect of this thing and just thinking about how that comes up in my day, how I can recognize when any kind of pride is coming in, which still hard to see. I think actually there's a lot to learn about this, and talking with people has been one of my best sources of learning. There was a person who used to live here who was also wanting to learn about it. This isn't the first time she ever talked to Venerable Chodron about it. Venerable Chodron says, well, do you really think that you have anything you can learn from somebody else? For her, it was kind of like, this is a lawyer. It was like, boom, it kind of like, it really helped her to recognize it. And I thought, these are, for me, are the kind of examples I have to have in order to start to recognize something that can be very difficult to recognize, is very, in our culture, is actually modeled, supported, maybe encouraged sometimes, so we're, again, trying to swim upstream against something that we can't always even see. So having stories and conversations and then sitting with these things, I think is the first step. And then recognizing that pride is related to our sense of self. And, we're going to have subtle levels of this until we get rid of the self. So it's not something that's going to go away right away. But any level, I think, that we recognize and can work with will be beneficial. And going back to the initial motivation, really, trying to connect with others, trying to be able to learn, to learn. You can't, if you're proud, you aren't going to take anything in. Trying to be able to have a kind of develop our loving kindness for others. We need to have the ability to dispel this hindrance. So maybe we do this.